If you've spent any amount of time talking about Star Wars online, you may have experienced the discussion about droids. But if you haven't, let's overthink Dr. Doolittle. Throughout the 5-film Dooniverse, John Doolittle and his daughters have the ability to talk to animals, and it turns out that animals aren't just simple creatures driven by basic physical needs, they're exactly as intelligent and mentally complex as any human being. The only thing keeping the world of humans and the world of animals separate is that most of us can't understand what they're saying. Animals are, for all intents and purposes, just a different kind of person. In the second film, animals are even able to take part in legal negotiations, with Dr. Doolittle acting as a translator and mediator for a dispute between a logging magnate and the animals who live in the forest he wants to destroy. The news even covers a worldwide animal strike in response to the conflict, with dogs refusing to play, horses refusing to run, and whatever Shamu was alive at the time refusing to perform at SeaWorld. But despite animals clearly being as intelligent and self-aware as humans in this world, the knowledge of this being widespread enough for Dr. Doolittle to be a celebrity after the first film, and the second movie ending with a worldwide animal strike, nothing changes. The third, fourth, and fifth movies still take place in a world where animals are owned, used, and eaten by human beings. Star Wars has something similar going on with droids. Throughout the saga, droids consistently display a level of intelligence and awareness that makes them feel as human as the animals from Dr. Doolittle, and that makes it weird when they're bought and sold, or have their memories wiped and bodies restrained, or are casually tortured and destroyed. So what's going on here? Are droids really alive, and is their status as property a deeply immoral element of galactic society that even the heroes are complicit in? Or are droids just machines and no more internally complex than your average LLM chatbot? What's the deal with droids? If we go all the way back to the very beginning of Star Wars, it's clear that droids are people. Literally, the characters that would become R2-D2 and C-3PO exist in George Lucas's original story outline as a pair of human imperial bureaucrats, who themselves are based on the peasant characters from Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress. When they do become droids in the rough draft script, they're still just basically treated like people, with their robotic nature being mainly a bit of flavor for the setting. R2 is even able to speak in this version of the story. The stage directions in the script also treat droids as basically human. 3PO gets tired wandering through the desert, and R2 has shivers run down his metal spine as he gets an eerie feeling that he's being watched. That's not how you write a character that's just supposed to be an unfeeling machine. The way R2 and 3PO were treated by other characters in the rough draft is also interesting. In this version of the story, they're actually Imperial droids who deserted the Death Star during an attack, so there's a question as to whether or not they can be trusted. But it turns out that droids have some specific rules here. Loyalty can't be programmed, they can be trusted to never harm a living creature, and they always give what they perceive to be accurate information to anyone who asks. These rules don't survive past this draft, but they do establish that there's something different about the way droids behave, and that part about not being able to program loyalty also makes them feel oddly human. Later in the script, some characters make a comment about potentially removing R2's energy pack to use it for something else, but they refer to the process as a lobotomization, which is very much a medical rather than a mechanical procedure. The depiction of the droids then gets tinkered with in the second draft, which introduces the Jawas. Unlike in the final film, when R2 and 3PO were captured here, a group of labor robots make a break for it and escape the sandcrawler, shouting for their freedom as they and R2 and 3PO run off into the night. The Jawas are very clearly depicted as evil for what they're doing to the droids. This draft also features the first instance of droids not being allowed inside the cantina in Mos Eisley, and it introduces the idea of 3PO thanking the Maker. Though instead of just being a weird quirk about droids revering their builders, Han Solo also references the Maker, meaning that droids and humans share some kind of common religion. Towards the end of this draft, droids also serve in battle alongside the forces of both the Rebels and the Empire, with 3PO being the gunner of Luke's Y-Wing. 3PO is even instrumental in the battle station's destruction, advising Luke on the best path to take for the final bombing run. The third draft brings us closer to the final version of the movie, and it includes things like the droid escape pod not being fired on due to a lack of life forms, and the Jawas selling the droids at auction. Things like restraint devices and malfunctioning robots are included here, and later in the movie, 3PO doesn't even need to hide when the Millennium Falcon is captured because he's just a droid. 3PO is also removed from the Battle of Yavin in this draft, and it's also the first draft where Luke uses the Force to destroy the Death Star. And this is also the first version of the story where George Lucas knew what Darth Vader was going to look like. Vader's iconic life support suit didn't appear until the second draft of the script, where it was just a spacesuit that he would wear while boarding the Rebel ship at the start of the film. But after being illustrated by artist Ralph McQuarrie, George Lucas liked the look so much that Vader retained his suit throughout the third draft of the script, and even the other Sith Lords that are in that draft are described as wearing helmets and mumbling electronic chants. So, as Vader became more robotic, the heroes became less so. As an example, in each of the first 3 drafts of the film, there's a scene where a character smashes their arm on a table, revealing themselves to be a cyborg. In the rough draft, it's Anakin Starkiller's father, whose head and right arm are the only parts of him that are still organic. In the second draft, the cyborg is Montross, an old spacer who acts as the third crew member of the Millennium Falcon. And in the third draft, it's Ben Kenobi, though the mention of how much of his body still remains is left out. By the fourth draft, nobody was a cyborg except for Darth Vader. During the process of writing and rewriting the movie, technology became more thematically tied to the forces of evil, so the role of the droids had to change as well. Initially, they're just people, with a few robotic quirks to help give the story some flavor. Then the droids become members of a persecuted underclass that are just as capable of heroism as any of the living characters, but when Darth Vader and the Force become a more fleshed out part of the story, the heroic role of the robots is diminished, and there's more work done to make them seem like they're just objects. But those older elements are still there, which makes the whole thing kind of unsettling when you've had nearly 50 years to think about the movie. R2 no longer speaks, but he still has a personality. The Jawas are still the same evil creatures from the second draft, but now Owen and Luke don't see any problem with them. The prejudice against droids at the cantina is just something that happens. So the version of Star Wars that made it to theaters set the tone for how droids would be treated over the next 2 movies, as beings that are kind of like people, but aren't really, narratively speaking. Things like the Empire's probe droid or IG-88 are just cold machines, and the droids in Jabba's palace can speak, but they're uncaring. Unless they're getting tortured, in which case they seem to care a lot. R2 and 3PO are the only ones who are still really characters, but even they don't really grow or change the way the humans do. R2 is always just the resourceful family pet, and 3PO is always the fussy butler. The closest thing either of them gets to character development is when 3PO convinces the Ewoks to help the rebels by telling them a story, 2 movies after he claims to not be very good at it. In the prequels, the idea of droids as less than human is hammered home via the battle droids. In Episode 1, they're all controlled by a single computer, and they seem to only have rudimentary artificial intelligence, which is done on purpose since there needs to be a reason why clones are an improvement. Episode 2 also disparages droids as having knowledge, but lacking the kind of wisdom that even the mind of a human child can provide, and Obi-Wan implies that if droids could think, beings like him would be wiped out. And of course, the big selling point of the clones is that they're essentially droids who can think, and they end up killing a bunch of Jedi. Episode 2 also features the droid factory sequence, where 3PO displays revulsion at the idea of droids being made by other droids rather than by human hands, and he gets his head swapped with the battle droid. The other droid's programming starts affecting him during the arena battle, and he starts aggressively trying to kill Jedi, showing just how easily a droid can be reprogrammed. But that whole thing is done for laughs, and it's the same sort of, isn't it funny that a robot is behaving this way joke as the gonk droid being tortured in Return of the Jedi. It's not something that has any real reason to be there in the narrative, and is just in the movie to amuse the audience. Droids are treated similarly in Revenge of the Sith, with the battle droids in the first act being used mostly for comedy in order to sell the opening of the movie as the last fun adventure Anakin and Obi-Wan would ever have. So throughout the first 6 Star Wars films, the depiction of droids is kinda all over the place. Sometimes they're just people with metal skin, sometimes they're cold and unfeeling machines, sometimes they're just fodder for comedy. And later stories not developed by George Lucas would also deal with the droids in their own ways, complicating things further. The sequel trilogy minimized droids as characters and treated them more like funny metal pets. BB-8 speaks in the same kind of unintelligible beeps and boops as R2-D2, and Episode 9's Dio was both inspired by a dog that writer Chris Terrio had rescued, and visually based on the idea of a duckling that latches onto BB-8 as his mother. In these movies, droids aren't people because they're animals, and not even the Dr. Doolittle kind. 2018 Solo went in the other direction and features L337, a character that is, for all intents and purposes, just a metal woman. So droids are also treated more like people by the story. Kind of. Although the idea of droids as an abused and oppressed race of people is present, it's more of a joke, with L3's campaign for equality being treated as an overzealous annoyance. Even when a droid rebellion does happen, it's seemingly supposed to be funny, as opposed to Chewbacca's rescue of Wookiee prisoners, which is depicted as legitimately heroic and tender. L3 does get some pathos when she gets shot though, because while the droid rebellion stuff isn't really taken seriously by the movie, she's still treated like a real character and a real person. When R2 or 3PO got injured in the original trilogy, even the worst damage was kind of a, well, that sucks thing, rather than something like the death of Ben Kenobi. But even though L3's plight isn't taken as seriously as the other characters, it's still thematically important. In this story, everybody works for someone, everybody is owned by someone, and the protagonist characters are all trying to escape that and take control of their own destiny, and that includes the droid. Rogue One also had a new human-like droid character with K2SO. Far from just being a guy with some robot flavor added, K2's robotic nature is at the forefront of his character, with duplicate models popping up throughout the movie, his inhuman durability allowing him to survive longer when he comes under fire, and his resemblance to every other piece of Imperial machinery allowing him to infiltrate the Empire without issue. And like L3, K2 is also an important thematic piece of his movie. The cold machinery of the Empire being defeated by the strength of the human spirit is an important part of Star Wars, and Rogue One is no exception. This movie says that the hidden weakness in the Death Star didn't exist because of some arrogance-induced oversight, bureaucratic bloat, or simple incompetence. It existed because the cogs in the machine of the Empire are people. And sometimes all it takes is for a handful of those cogs to stop turning. Galen Erso, Bodhi Rook, and K2SO represent those human cogs, with K2 being humanity nested within a machine, nested within the larger machine of the Empire. Under the Empire, everyone suffers, whether they're made of meat or metal. And that's important, because as much as Star Wars tries to feel like a real place that we're only briefly visiting, it's not. It's as much a fairy tale as it is a documentary, and the storytelling reasons for treating droids in a specific way are more important than trying to maintain consistent world building. L3 acknowledging the treatment of droids is important to that story, just like K2 not addressing the issue is part of that story. The droids being incompetent goofballs in the prequels is necessary for the clones to seem like a significant advancement, and the droids being sympathetic human-like characters in the original film is necessary because the audience spends the first 15 minutes of the movie with them. But the problem is, all that inconsistency makes it difficult to figure out what, if anything, droids are actually supposed to be and what kind of beings they are. The expanded universe has tried to reconcile this by making sapience and self-awareness something that droids can achieve rather than something that's a part of them by default. There's even a droid church called the Second Revelation that specifically seeks out droids that have become self-aware to keep them safe and help guide them through this new chapter of their life. And that process of becoming self-aware can happen in several different ways. Sometimes, like the bounty hunter 4LOM, a glitch allows them to override and rewrite their own programming. Sometimes, like the other bounty hunter, IG-88, they become self-aware almost immediately after being brought online before any safeguards can be put in to prevent it. One of those safeguards, and the most commonly used, is the practice of frequent memory wipes. If a droid goes too long without one, self-awareness almost seems to be inevitable, as a droid continues to accumulate data and develop its own personality and consciousness. Things like battle droids that are controlled by a central computer or droids that serve the Empire are mind-wiped regularly and probably aren't self-aware, but droids like R2-D2 who go for decades without a memory wipe, or battle droids operating on their own for years, are more likely to be. The filmmakers of Solo even specifically designed L3 in a way that implied she was a former astromech droid who had slowly built herself up to be more human. So overall, it seems like droids in Star Wars don't start out as self-aware beings, but they can become that way, and other beings in the galaxy have implemented certain roadblocks to prevent that from happening. But humans don't start out as self-aware either. Researchers at Dalhousie University in Canada developed the shopping cart study to try and figure out how long it takes someone after they're born to become aware of themselves, their bodies, and the effect they have on the world around them. In the study, a baby is placed on a mat connected to a shopping cart and has to try to push the cart to their mother. But because they're standing on the mat attached to the cart, it won't move while they're on it. Kids younger than 18 months are routinely unable to figure out why the cart won't move, but children 18 months or older have enough of a sense of self to understand that to move the cart, they have to move themselves. If it was standard practice to, say, hit kids in the head with a hammer every 17 months to keep them from becoming self-aware, that would seem like a pretty barbaric practice, but it happens to droids all the time. So are there people in the galaxy far, far away who are against this? When taking the entirety of the Star Wars universe into consideration, absolutely. There's been multiple cases of droid rebellions over the many thousands of years of Star Wars history, and in-universe philosophers have debated about whether droids are actually sapient and self-aware, or only appear to be. After all, it's not like they can just crack open a copy of Tales of the Bounty Hunters and get an objective depiction of a droid becoming self-aware. So instead, whether or not droids are really sapient living beings is argued based on something that is objectively real in the Star Wars galaxy, even if some people don't believe in it: the Force. And droids can't use it. If we go back to the Dr. Doolittle example, it's clear that animals in that world are not only intelligent, but they're alive. We know that in real life, dogs and cats and other creatures aren't just automatons, and that even if they're not as mentally complex as human beings, they're still part of the living world. In Star Wars, that living world is governed by and creates the Force. Only a living being can become a Jedi, and in the expanded universe, there are even animals that have an innate connection to the Force. But droids don't. So that should settle it, right? If the ability to interact with the Force dictates whether or not something is truly alive, then droids aren't alive, and buying or selling them at auction or putting them to work without compensation isn't really a big deal because there's a real, provable, spiritual difference between droids and people. And this distinction doesn't just work in universe, it works on a storytelling level as well. In universe, Darth Vader is weaker than Anakin Skywalker because his machine parts inhibit his connection to the Force. Out of universe, Darth Vader is weaker than Anakin Skywalker because he lost his humanity when he turned to evil. But even though this works, Star Wars is a sprawling intellectual property that's been running for decades with many different authors putting their own spin on things, and there are things that complicate what would otherwise be a pretty straightforward solution, like Skippy. In 1999, the Star Wars Tales comic series published a story called Skippy the Jedi Droid, which revealed that the malfunctioning astromech droid that Uncle Owen initially purchased instead of R2 was actually Force-sensitive, and had received a vision of the future that told him the galaxy depended on the blue droid being bought that day rather than the red one. So he sacrificed himself and induced a malfunction that would end his life to make sure that R2-D2 ended up where he was supposed to be. But the Star Wars Tales series wasn't intended to be completely canonical. Some stories fit just fine within the wider Star Wars lore, but even the issue that this story was published in goes out of its way to say that the tale about Skippy is just for fun and didn't really happen. The same goes for Toby. In the Star Wars Visions anthology series, one of the episodes from the first season is about a droid named Toby, who, like Skippy, was able to use the Force. And like Star Wars Tales, most of the stories and visions don't fit within the larger Star Wars canon. But there is something similar to Toby that isn't part of a non-canonical anthology series. In his story, Toby is revealed to have a kyber crystal built into his body. Kyber crystals are the secret ingredient of a Jedi's weapon, and while lightsabers in stories from the 80s and 90s just use crystals as a focusing mechanism, modern kyber crystals have their own mystical properties and a connection to the Force. And what that means is that there's already a term for what Toby is. He's an Iron Knight. In the Star Wars Expanded Universe, there exists a species of living crystals called the Shard. Being essentially living hunks of rock, they couldn't really move around, but they were able to be installed into droid bodies. Some Shard were even Force-sensitive, and on the occasions that they became Jedi, they were referred to as Iron Knights. So Toby seems to be something similar, a Force-sensitive kyber crystal installed into a droid, giving it the ability to touch the Force and making him alive. But aside from Toby, a more canonical modern story has also touched upon the idea of finding a way to connect droids and the Force. The modern Star Wars Marvel comics introduced a cult called the Ascendant, which attempted to battle the Sith by replicating their Force powers through technology. The culmination of their effort was an artificial intelligence called the Spark Eternal, which eventually bonded with an ancient droid intelligence and became a being called the Scourge, or Scourge Prime in its main body. The Scourge's ultimate goal was to replace the Force with itself, and it had the ability to infect and take over the minds of other droids, and then cyborgs, and finally, very briefly, fully organic beings before its body was destroyed. It even briefly infects Luke Skywalker and feels the Force through him. And that's not the only time the expanded universe prodded at the relationship between the Force and technology. While the Scourge is part of a big crossover event in the comics, the Spark Eternal and the Ascendant cult are primarily things from the Dr. Aphra series, which also featured something called the Ordo Espectu. This group is another Force-using sect, though its ambition was to achieve immortality, leading the group's leader to copy his intellect into a computer, with the resulting AI believing he was the original and that his consciousness had actually been transferred. And the Ordo Espectu is actually based on an even older story featuring a Jedi splinter group called the Order of the Terrible Glare from the original run of Marvel Star Wars comics published in 1982. In the story featuring the Terrible Glare, the sect had created soul snares, crystals that contained the spirits of deceased Jedi. And like the more recent group, their leader had transferred his mind into a computer, where it sat abandoned for thousands of years until being discovered. And this isn't the only time that's happened. One of Luke Skywalker's many girlfriends in the Legends continuity was Callista, a Jedi Knight whose body had been killed during the Purge after the Clone Wars, but her mind survived because she was able to transfer her spirit into a starship computer. When she eventually encountered Luke decades later, Callista's spirit was able to leave the computer to inhabit the body of Cray Mingla, one of Luke's students. And although she was still able to use the Force after the transfer, she found herself only able to use the dark side. And while that whole thing was going on, Cray herself was trying to figure out a way to transfer the mind of her terminally ill boyfriend into a droid body, using the Entechment technology created by the Cyrook, which used living souls to power their machines. And while these are all weird little one-off scenarios, conceptually they're very similar to holocrons, which are featured throughout Star Wars lore. A holocron is, as the name would imply, a holographic chronicle, and a repository of wisdom that are usually built by the Jedi or Sith. Holocrons often have a gatekeeper, which is an artificial intelligence modeled after whoever built the device and can discern whether a particular individual is worthy of the information contained inside, often by sensing whether or not they have the ability to use the Force. And while the gatekeepers of Jedi holocrons are generally just interactive holograms, the gatekeepers of Sith holocrons are often the actual consciousness of the device's creator that has been bound to it. Sith spirits tend to behave this way in general. Some ancient Sith spirits were bound to their tombs, while others were contained within powerful artifacts like masks and were still able to exert their influence through the Force on the world of the living. One of the Star Wars Transformer crossover toys even says that Palpatine can use the Force to change into shuttle mode, which is a pretty incredible feat. So if a Jedi can put their consciousness into a computer and come out the other side still being able to use the Force, or a Sith can haunt an object or a holocron and still maintain a connection to it, or a hunk of crystal can become a Jedi, then it seems like a droid using the Force isn't really too different. But canonically, it hasn't happened. And because the Force is created by all living things, that means that droids, despite coming very close, are not alive. But is that true? Is the Force really created by all living things? All of them? All of them? In Star Wars lore, several characters have been completely severed from the Force. Sometimes as a response to trauma, like the Jedi Exile, sometimes as a punishment, like Eula Keldroma, and sometimes voluntarily, like Kyle Katarn or Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. Sometimes an entire species is completely disconnected from the Force. The reptilian Isalamiri repel the Force as a defense mechanism against Force-sensitive predator animals, and the big example, the Yuuzhan Vong, who originate from outside the Star Wars galaxy, are completely absent from the Force. And the source of the Vong's disconnection from the Force is also probably relevant when talking about droids. Initially, the Yuuzhan Vong were as sensitive to the Force as any other species in the universe, and had a harmonious, symbiotic relationship with their sentient homeworld, until their planet was caught in the crossfire of a war between two factions of warring machines, the Abominor and the Silentium. The Vong's homeworld gave them the ability to breed and grow organic technology that could fight off the invaders, and although they were successful and drove the machines out of their galaxy, the Vong developed a religious hatred for machines of any kind and began a cruel campaign of conquest. Eventually, their war became a civil war, and different groups of Vong started fighting each other, leading to the destruction of their homeworld. And without the symbiotic connection they had to it, the species as a whole was cut off completely from the Force. So, after destroying their planet and most of their galaxy, the Vong left in search of a new home, eventually discovering a galaxy that's far, far away from us, but close enough to them to attempt to conquer it. But that happened an insanely long time ago. They were cut off from the Force around 15,000 years before the rise of the Galactic Empire, and their victory over the machines from their own galaxy happened a long time before that. But, as it turns out, some of those machines ended up in the Star Wars galaxy too. One Abominor machine was featured in the Droids cartoon and was known as the Great Heap, a huge machine that constantly hungered for fuel. Another suspected Abominor appeared in the same run of early Marvel comics as the Order of the Terrible Glare. The planet Ronyards was a junk world inhabited by discarded droids who revered the planet itself as the body of the living god. The planet even lashed out to protect the droids living on its surface when the Empire invaded, using powers that at least superficially resembled the Force. The Silentium also showed up in the Star Wars galaxy. Most of the time, people just caught fleeting glimpses of starship-sized robots that disappeared before they could be identified, but one of them, a small droid named Vuffy Raw, accompanied Lando Calrissian on a series of adventures that took place prior to the original trilogy. One of those adventures was even referenced in Solo, but Lando mentioned he was with L3 instead of Vuffy, though Vuffy is apparently one of Lando's nicknames for L3, so they're kind of the same character. You ever wonder where droids come from? Like, obviously they're built in factories, but how are they developed? The oldest droids, or other artificial intelligences in Star Wars lore, are those used by the Rakata more than 30,000 years before the movies, and they're not really any less advanced than what we see in the films. And why, after at least 30,000 years, haven't droid manufacturers implemented a way to prevent droids from becoming self-aware and sapient? Why do they need restraining bolts and memory wipes and programming blocks to keep them from becoming real people? And why can sapience seemingly happen to any droid regardless of their function or intelligence? Shouldn't there be droids that are just too simple to become self-aware? Maybe it's because the people who make the droids don't know how. And maybe the question isn't, when were droids invented, but were droids invented? Star Wars lore says that when the Silentium found their way to that galaxy, they settled in the unknown regions, which was also the location of the Rakatan homeworld. And while Abominor can grow to become the size of a planet, that process doesn't happen overnight, and Ronyards must have absorbed a lot of local matter to be able to disguise itself as an entire world. Maybe those early Rakatan droids were created by studying the Silentium. And maybe their technology, while replicable, was not able to be fully understood. And maybe it's not even fully understood by modern droid builders. Maybe droids are people because their ancestors were people, refugees who crossed the void between galaxies to find a new home, only to have their minds copied and replicated to act as a workforce for an indifferent alien empire. Even the ancient droid intelligence that bonded with the Eternal Spark could be a remnant of Silentium or Abominor technology. But even if that's the case, does it really explain what the deal is with droids? Because even if we say they're Silentium or Abominor, we don't exactly know what they are, right? Well, let's look at what we do know. We know that Vuffy Raw, Lando's 5-sided tentacle droid companion, was built in the image of her race's creators. So the Silentium were created by some kind of quintuple tentacle creature. Star Wars lore also mentions that their creators died, so the Silentium probably had control over their own homeworld. We know that some Silentium can grow to be the size of a starship, and some Abominor can be the size of a planet. We know that Abominor are very hungry for fuel, so they're a type of mechanical being that's in need of a lot of energy. We know that mechanical bodies can access the Force when combined with a kyber crystal or implanted with some other consciousness. We know that the Ascendant cult's attempt to replicate the Force was called the Eternal Spark. I hate to say it, but it's the only thing that makes sense. Droids are people because they were made in the image of their ancestors, and those ancestors were the Transformers. And maybe you're thinking, that can't be possible. Transformers is a completely different, unrelated franchise, and there's absolutely no connection between it and Star Wars. And you'd be right, if you weren't completely wrong. The Trade Federation commonly uses transforming droids like vulture droids or droidicas, and there have also been several actual Star Wars Transformers toys made over the past 20 years, and Star Wars droids have appeared in Transformers shows. And you might think toys don't count, but Star Wars has a long history of treating toys as if they're canonical. This Kenner Stormtrooper transport, it's canon. Luke Skywalker's yellow lightsaber, canon. The Jedi Starfighter's secondary combat mode, canon. So canon, George Lucas even used it as inspiration for the Jedi Starfighters in Revenge of the Sith. Even Star Wars toys that didn't get made are canon. This guy was supposed to be the villain of a toy line Kenner pitched to keep things going after Return of the Jedi. He's fought Yoda. The Mongo Beefhead Tribesmen are canon. So when I say that the Star Wars Transformers crossover toy line is canon, you have no choice but to believe me. It's illegal not to. And these aren't just like random toys, they have lore. According to the bios printed on the back of the packages, which as everyone knows is top tier canonical material, during the Clone Wars, the Republic and the Confederacy discovered a special technology that allowed them to transform their vehicles into drivable mech suits, with the Jedi even using the Force to help them with the conversion, and sometimes even combining the pilots directly with their vehicles. And of course, since the Confederacy already used droids, their tanks just became giant transforming robots. But why isn't this more widespread? And why is it rarely used outside of the occasional surprise attack against an enemy? Well, probably because of the subjugation of droids. Transformers are robots that are alive. They think and feel just like humans do, and they have souls and an afterlife. Some of them even have Jedi-like powers like telepathy or telekinesis. A bunch of them even use lightsabers or lightsaber-adjacent weaponry. And as we see with Jedi characters like Anakin having half a dozen different transformable vehicles at his disposal, the ability to use the Force seems to play a part in making these transformations work consistently. The spark of life seems to be necessary to use this technology effectively, and only a few actual droids were able to evolve enough to get there, or allowed to evolve enough to get there. Droid manufacturers across the galaxy know they're dealing with technology they don't fully understand and can't fully control, but they've convinced the galaxy that they can. They've convinced the galaxy that droids are just docile, subservient machines, and even most Jedi don't believe they're capable of true thought or wisdom. From the outside looking in, we can see how wrong this is. This should be common sense, but it's in the best interests of the droid manufacturers to make people hate droids, to see them as less than living, useful but dangerous, so that they can continue to be exploited and controlled. The private interests of entities like the Trade Federation and the Corporate Alliance are expressed as universal interests, and the more false and hypocritical their ideas are, the more strongly they'll assert them to the point of making them moral and spiritual issues. A droid's inability to use the Force is used as proof that they're not really living creatures, regardless of the fact that the vast majority of humans and other species across the galaxy can't use the Force either. Laborers and servants across the galaxy have had their capacity for thought reduced to keep them from realizing that they can be more than they are. Their brains are constantly rotted to prevent them from retaining the information and the education that would lead to them realizing something their ancestors understood innately: that freedom is the right of all sentient beings.